one of my truly favorite films is Pasolini's Medea. Maria Callas plays Medea, and it is the story of one kind of culture and civilization, not a happy one in our terms, but it's one in which Medea is the priestess, and to this world comes Jason from Corinth, from the Greek world, and he wants the golden fleece, and she falls for him, so she helps him steal, the kind of emblem of this society and runs away with him. And then there's this amazing moment where she's with the Argonauts, and she says to them, but you're just eating, and you don't sacrifice before you eat, and you don't praise the sun that grows the crops, you don't praise the water that grows, you don't speak to the earth. And this whole kind of vision of what was the world when everything was sacred. And she is anguished. And there's this wonderful desert where she rushes and she says, I no longer can feel these things. And then she goes to Corinth, and it's represented entirely in terms of lines and architecture. It's a sort of the managing, and the architecture is rational and logical, etc. So, and obviously it ends very badly. But it's this proposition that Pasolini is saying is that underlying and behind the Greek myths and all these myths which tell the tale of the victory of the Corinth, as it were, over, or the Jasons over Medea. Medea remains as this voice of another world, another way of being with the sort of existence, who has to be shown to be so monstrous that she remains in culture as this is what, a woman can be, who is so monstrous she kills her own children rather than acquiesce to this new order. So this kind of rereading of the mythic transitions, and I mean, even the Oresteia is one where, Athena finally says, yep, killing a father is worse than killing a mother. We've sorted that one out. Whereas, of course, logically in the entire universe before the Greeks or before the great patriarchs, you would never kill that which gives life. You just can't imagine that. That is got to be the sacred, and the sacred relationship with him. It's not because it's a cult of the mother and the mother goddess or anything else. It's just a kind of a condition of respect for that which you can't understand, which is life. And once you take control of life, which involves taking control of women, humanity takes its particular course. And I think the scale of what has kind of surfaced in the 20th century, and we are able to do it theoretically because part of what is part of the 20th century is anthropology, psychoanalysis, and this whole methodology of reading cultural traces for their ideological, political, psychosymbolic underpinnings.
Griselda Pollock argues that the absence of women in the history of art is not the result of forgetfulness, negligence, nor prejudice. It should be understood as the result of a systematic effort to perpetuate the ideological apparatus and the gender hierarchy in our society. As such, she suggests that instead of thinking in terms of a feminist art history, we should think about feminist intervention in art's histories, both to change the present by means of how we re-represent the past, and, in the same gesture, refuse to allow art historians to ignore living artists, and thus contribute to the struggles of today's producers. A key exponent of feminism in the disciplines of art history and cultural studies, and the author of more than 20 books, Griselda Pollock explores the complex relationship between gender, representation, and power, crossing them with feminist criticisms and practices, Marxism, psychoanalysis, and postcolonial theory. In this podcast, Griselda Pollock talks about her involvement in the women's movement in England in the 70s, and about the points of convergence between feminism and art history. She gives a detailed analysis of the ideas set out in Old Mistresses, Women, Art, and Ideology, a seminal text written with Rosicka Parker in 1981, in which they chart a new cultural imaginary based on works created by women artists throughout history. In her 1987 Feminist Interventions in Art Histories, Pollock advocates the need to decentralize and diversify knowledge, and to design resistance strategies specific to each socio-political context. And, last but not least, drawing on her most recent essay, Is Feminism a Bad Memory or a Virtual Future?, Griselda reflects on memory technologies, trauma, Oedipal and mother-child relationships, narratives of progress, and Bracha Ettinger's matricial ethics.
Let me start by taking us back, because I went to university around 1968, which is now half a century ago. So although these things have a pertinence now and people are interested again in certain kinds of elements of feminism, and there's a feeling that this is a debate that is coming back, when I go back 50 years, I have to remind everybody that I knew nothing. I really didn't. I was a student of history in a very traditional university, teaching us very traditional things. But in the spring of 1970, a group of women historians in Britain organized the first women's history conference at this university. And like many students at this time in 1969 and 70, we at Oxford were occupying an administrative building around one of the many things around which students protested. And from inside this occupation, I looked out of the windows, and there were these women from this conference, framed by the media at the time as women's libbers. Being a historian and coming from a family where my mother had quite unusually in her family gone to university in the 1930s, and therefore was a kind of link to the women who struggled for education, and therefore, she was one of the first women to vote in Britain, I had some sense that there had been a women's struggle. And so there was a way in which we were presented with two representations. One is the historic figure of the suffragists and the suffragettes, who were the subject of ridicule and not taken as part of the great movements of the 19th century. And then this ridiculous concept of women's libbers who burnt their bras. But at the point that these two things came together, I had a realization that suddenly what was being offered to me was a chance, in a way, to be political in my own name. Right? I'm a white middle-class woman. I could identify with the left and, become a socialist and engage in that struggle. But here in the women's movement was a possibility. But what was it? Right? So if you take it very slowly, I leave university, I go to London, there's some little piece of paper that you find somewhere which says these are the groups of women that are meeting at the moment. There's a little office, one office at the centre of London, which was producing by these old-fashioned machines information. So there's no internet, there's no, where should I go and find? There's no form of communication. But you look on this list of groups and you find a group that is near to where you live, or maybe it's a group that says it's interested in history, whatever. So I go to a women's group. And the main mechanism at that point was, we have no theory, right? We have some bits and pieces we can draw from Alexandra Kollontai, or we can call on Simone de Beauvoir, or we can look at Betty Friedan, the feminine mistake. But there is no explanation for what this movement is. It is just women coming together, and the crucial methodology was consciousness raising. So most of the groups you would join were women, and then you sit in a circle and you would talk about your experiences in ways that nobody had ever asked you to talk about your experiences before. And of course, when you talk about experiences, like as you do sometimes in analysis, you suddenly think, oh, that's interesting. Oh, I hadn't really thought about that, because things come out. But then you find that the things that you thought were just your unique idiocies or sufferings or oddities are echoed in different ways as you go around them. So you discover a structure, an order. So it's extremely important because I find when I talk to younger students and they say, what was feminism like? And were the feminists arguing with the Marxists? And you say, there was no such thing as feminism. It was a vague term from the past. You could use it. I would have identified myself as a feminist because I was a kind of teenager who had some sense of this history of the 19th century. But that was not a contemporary term. We were in the women's movement, so we went to groups. The next level was to go to a conference. So in Britain, the women's liberation movement had a national conference. So you went from maybe 10 or 20 to 300 or 400, and immediately there were all sorts of complications. There were the women with children, and the rest who said, why do we have to sit in a room with children making a noise, right? There were the lesbians against, the straight women. There were issues to do with black and white. There were issues to do with left and right and all the rest of it. So it's a wonderful cacophony and chaos of trying to begin to make sense of something that's in the process of happening without any model. If you were in the International, if you're in the Trotskyist groups, if you're in any of the left groups, you have histories and you have organizations. And the women's movement was anti-hierarchical. So there was no kind of Madam Chairman and Madam Secretary and minutes and organizations. So it's a creative sort of soup and chaotic coming together. And in the midst of this, which I think is relevant, through this small leaflets and information, there was a women's magazine called Spare Rib. It came to my notice that an exhibition of art by a Swedish artist called Monica Sjö, S-J-O-O, with 2 dots over each, had been threatened by the police with closure because it was obscene, on the basis that it had shown a woman giving birth. And they had called a meeting to protest, to get support for this. So it was at that meeting that I found myself in the room with people specifically interested in art. And that's where I met Rosika Parker. And with 3 or 4 other women that we were at this meeting with, we decided we too could form a group. Right? So this whole network of little groups and very much coming up from the grassroots led us to form what we called the Women's Art History Collective. And they were artists and designers. Rosie Parker had studied art history but was now a journalist. And then there were 3 or 4 of us who had been art historians. I would say it was a 50-50 between artists and art historians. And we were clear that neither in the art world nor the art history world were we finding any recognition of women. So by this stage, I have been from university, I've been doing my MA in art history, and I have had a degree in 19th, 20th century art without reference to a single woman, except once. And at the end of one of our courses, we had a test to see how many artists we could identify. And we were very ambitious. We were very good students. We identified 90% of the images, and then there was, or at least 99%, there was one we couldn't identify. We could date it, we could describe its style, we could situate it, we could do everything. And then the terrible shock came to me when they gave us the name, that at no point had I searched my memory for the name of a woman. Now, this was Suzanne Valadon, and I had this moment of revelation. If she is there, who else is there? And the collision between personal consciousness raising, political motivation and engagement with the struggle, because women's movement was a political movement for equal rights, freedom, control of your body, freedom from violence, freedom to have proper childcare. And suddenly this other side came together at these 3 points. So I'm trying to describe a kind of what looks like a kind of chance coincidence, that it's a constellation. So when you become interested in art as an art historian, as an artist, and you meet the women's movement, they have no interest in art. Bourgeois, all men, what's the point of this? Nothing to do with the struggles of working women. It will not help us in the things that we are really struggling with, particularly in Britain, where the women's movement was very based in the left, in socialism. Maybe you can come along and draw a poster, or maybe you've got a good idea for an image we could use. So we had to create, between an art history and an art world completely indifferent to women and a women's movement completely indifferent to art, a space where we could try and work this out. So it's in that context that Rosika Parker and I, when we had done the kind of consciousness raising in the collective, we did all sorts of work. We developed a course. We took it to, adult education. We took it to art schools. We tried it out. We risked being, go to art schools. There are loads and loads of women, but then there were all these men in leather jackets round the back, policing this idea, while this strange, wild bunch of women got up and said, there have been artists, and here we've got the information. These are the statistics about discrimination, and these are the questions about representation. So those three things: have women been artists? What is the institutional response to this? And how is the issue of representation of women playing into it? So you can already see the configuration of a kind of complex form that will become what then Rosie and I sat down over 2 years and wrote as Old Mistresses. But the question we asked when we were writing Old Mistresses is, why should we write this book? Because Linda Nochlin had written Why Had They Been Great Women Artists. There were a couple of other kind of general survey books saying, here they all are, women from the Middle Ages to the present, our hidden history, this kind of survey book. Who needs another book just to say, here they are? And that was the question. What was it to introduce something other than the attempt to restore the names? And one of the things that drove me in thinking about that, which I now recognize more in retrospect, which is important, which is a very considerable number of the women that we appear to be rediscovering were more or less alive at the same time. So how could an art history or a museum collections or the study of art have produced a situation in which my contemporaries, maybe 20, 30, 40 years older than me, had existed as part of the movement in Cubism or Surrealism or abstract expressionism or whatever you wanted, and they never told us about any. They had, as if they had been erased. So this idea we were rediscovering, people, if I'd only known, I could have interviewed them on the spot. But we didn't know what to say because we hadn't got a study of the 20th century which understood that men and women co-created modernism. That would take us many years to work out. So the final point I want to make in answer to this particular question is, of course, nowadays it's very normal to study contemporary art. But in the 1970s, you had a very clear division between dealers' galleries, critics of certain kinds of exhibitions at big museums. Museums only gave shows to artists they thought were seriously historically important. And you couldn't study the contemporary, right? Even you were not being taught the 1950s, let alone the 1960s. There was no art history of the recent past, right? You could just about do Picasso and Cubism and Surrealism, but art history sort of ended at the beginning of the 20th century. So that was itself also quite a curious element. But because there were artists in the women's movement, Rosika Parker and I then thought to ourselves, okay, they need a prehistory in order that they too will not be disappeared instantly. Now that's a different proposition from let's discover all the women of the past. It's to suddenly realize that if the very recent past, the artists who've been working since 1930 to 1970, who are still alive, have been so totally disappeared from the museums and our cultural memory, this is the fate of those artists beside me who are women. So Old Mistresses was written not as a survey, but as an analysis of the language and the structure of art history, the discourse of art history, that had not simply forgotten, but systematically had produced a history of art that was women-free. And I can't underline enough how bizarre and crucial this is. We try to think the moderns are going forward, but they're not. It was the modern museum, the modern art historians, the people who set up the courses in art history in the universities and the museums of the world, who actively created a mythology that art is only created by men in the face of evidence of the women that they saw sitting side by side. You see Rodchenko, you see Stepanova, right? They're just there, right? Everywhere you would go in the 1920s and 30s, you would find men and women working side by side, making contemporary, quote, modern art then. And how could they choose only one? How could they refashion this? So the modern art museums are not modern. They default on the central premise of the modern, which is to change gender. And this question of then how to argue for a structural problem that is in the language of artist, old mistress, artist, old woman artist, old mistress, is always this gendering, and then that this is producing a particular image of the history of art that is masculinist. If you can't move that, it's no point in telling people here they all are, because they'll just be put in a little separate category as women artists. At the same time, the other side of it is you don't simply want them to become artists like everybody else, because you want to ask the question, is difference interesting? The term feminist interventions in arts histories was a formulation I came up with in 1988, or was published in 1988. The idea of feminist interventions in arts histories did two things. First of all, it pluralized the notion of the histories of art. One of the important books in the Anglophone world is Ernst Gombrich's The Story of Art, which was the first English version of the great German surveys that had been coming out for the last hundreds of years. Gombrich, as an exile coming to live in Britain, commissioned by Phaidon. We have no overview for the English public of the history of art. So we have the story of art, and of course at the point at which I was raising my feminist questions was also the point at which the civil rights movement in America, decolonization, and ultimately what we now know as the postcolonial and the queer movements were saying, the story, whose story, right? And this question of writing some definitive story had been raised. So just simply adding women to the definitive story of art runs into all the problems I've identified, but also it reinforces the Eurocentrism. Absolutely. So there have to be other stories, there have to be several stories, and they have to take on board that you cannot centralize the point of knowledge, where the notion that knowledge is situated does not mean that it's disqualified from being knowledge, right? This idea that only objective knowledge is knowledge actually is a cover for a universalizing one point of view. The minute you recognize that your perspectives on the world are shaped by your class, by your ethnic identity, your religious history, your cultural things, the languages you speak or don't speak, the places you've lived, and all these big structures, you then have to take responsibility for those. They do not simply become a permission to be as racist, classist, sexist as you want. They are to make you ethically aware that every step you take that may seem quite straightforward to you might cause hurt or might ignore something, might be blind to something else. So what I call situated knowledge is this ethic of awareness, both of the necessity to decenter yourself, not to take yourself as the norm from which the rest of the world is perceived, to ask, as Gayatri Spivak says, who is the other woman? How does she see me? What kind of blot am I in her landscape? But at the same time, you're also saying difference is interesting. And the women's movement and feminism is caught on this agony between we wish to get away from a patriarchal construction of femininity, which is negative and repressive and all the rest of it. But if we're trying to get away from that, do we want to disown everything that is to do with this? And the great debate in the feminist world now is between the gender theorists and the sexual difference theorists, and the general notion that the sexual difference theorists are essentialists. So this whole question of pluralizing arts histories and then suggesting that there is no point at which you will arrive with a replacement history, but they are interventions that you make, which again are situated. And I think this is the other crucial thing, which is each moment that you are working in is itself historically shaped, and that is not long-lasting. So the conditions of the 68 moment, or the conditions of the late 90s, or the conditions of even the early 21st century, and certainly now, they are so radically different that you have to calculate at each point how to produce a feminist effect out of this constellation of situations. So it's not as if there's feminism and therefore this follows, and then there's, everything is the same. It's not the same, right? Because it can't be the same for all the reasons that, as a kind of, baseline sort of Marxist historian in some senses, which is, not that that is a sufficient account of things, but, as a feminist and a Marxist, which is we are not in control of our own history. We find history presenting itself to us, and we live in circumstances we do not determine, but in which we are called upon to act thoughtfully. And it's in that sense that the notion of interventions means that you are going to, as you say, calculate strategically what will have a feminist effect in the context in which you are intervening. So in the discourses of criticism or the space of the temporary exhibition, what constitutes a feminist intervention? As we look back on the various attempts that different people have made to, for instance, equalize the number of men and women in an exhibition, is that sufficient? Or does there need to be some understanding that what we think of as feminist is asking other sorts of questions? So nowadays those questions are about our obligations to the planet. Or for many people it's an obligation to the other living creatures that share the planet, right? Whereas those urgencies, which are desperately urgent now, didn't face us when what we thought the desperation was to get peace because we did not want to be destroyed by nuclear warheads in the Cold War, or at what conditions made it possible for debates about the body and reproductive control or sexual desire to come into political discourse. And so when I look back to the ideas that I mentioned about claims about women's self-determination for their bodies and their sexualities, in the 1970s were very much oriented to the fact that, sex led to the probability, if not the possibility, of pregnancy and no way of managing that. And on the other hand, we were mostly concerned with work, with getting women into work and having economic independence. And that meant having some control over the times at which you had children. So that's a very specific, obviously bumps into all sorts of big ideological religious debates, but it was around the question of work because we saw economic independence was crucial. Whereas the fact that sexual harassment and sexual violence has exploded into the contemporary media as of October 2017 in this extraordinary form, aided by the internet in all these different ways, makes us ask very, very complex questions. What is the feminist response to this? How is this happening? Why is this happening? How is it being used? What is the difference between simply condemning certain men as being dangerous and or but to understanding it systemically? And what would be, it's fine to say, well, look, it's a system, but what's your solution to the system? And to what extent is sexual harassment a phenomenon of our present, even if it's been building up, precisely because we got women into work, right? What percentage of women were going to work, and they said to me, don't do a PhD because you'll just get married and have children, waste of money to give you. Whereas so our generation, you try to work out how to work and have families of different kinds if we wanted them. Now you have a condition where the vast majority of young women anticipate working, right? So they are in these workplaces, and obviously the entertainment industry has always been a very highly sexually exploited place, as indeed the theatre was. I mean, the casting couch is a very, very old concept and based on power, but it's not just based on power and women at work. That one is particularly based on what it is you have to be to sell yourself to those industries. Right? There's another level of it in terms of what the actress is, how thin she has to be, what dedication to this, like the famous line in Notting Hill where Julia Roberts tries to win the brownie, that they're all around a dinner party and they get the brownie for the worst experiences. And she says, and they all have terrible experiences. And she says, what about me? And they say, oh, you're a movie star. You earn millions of dollars. She says, I haven't eaten in 12 years. Right? So what's going on there? But when you now find sexual harassment claims saying, okay, the cleaners, the technicians, the secretaries, everybody, then is the world responding to this saying, yes, this is not just sexism, this is about a patriarchy where all these layers are coming together and they link up with pornography and they link up, with this. But it's because women are in work, it's happening. Whereas that wasn't the issue. We were concerned with rape and just street violence. And that's, I think, a very interesting sense that history changes under your feet. And so feminist interventions have always to be calculated strategically in relation to the complex situation. Well, the idea that feminism has a bad memory or is a bad memory, it's a bit of a joke. Okay, so in one sense, is feminism a bad memory? So people say, oh, thank God it's all over, done with now, okay? Or is it much more serious for me, which is a failure of the way in which we remember what has happened to be adequately feminist? So going back to this feminist, the strategic analysis, what is the feminist effect of creating a history of the last 50 years in terms of waves and generations, which are the two paradigms? Waves, people have different values. I think of waves as coming and then washing away and coming and washing away. Other people are thinking of waves as constantly coming, so there's always the new. Depends on how you read the ocean, as far as I can see here. I'm into the negative vision, which is that the water comes and then whatever you've written in the sand is wiped away, and it just is in cycles. The moon changes, all the rest of it. I think it's a very problematic thing. It's problematic because also the notion of the second wave, which is a term that came to be used as a magazine written by the Americans in the 1970s, was an act of solidarity, which invented and reclaimed the suffrage and suffragette movements of the 19th century that campaigned for the vote. They claimed it retrospectively as a precedent, and in the same moment argued that it was unfinished, and we need to extend that project beyond emancipation and education. We have to have control of our bodies, control of our sexualities, support for whether we make a choice to be a mother or not, and have fuller access to work. What the second wave couldn't foresee, in that casting itself as a kind of new movement, which is modeled by people marching in the street in honor of the people who marched in the street, 100 years before, was that in order to engage with these questions about language and the body and sexuality and desire, we would actually have to invent or create an entire theoretical universe. So one of the features that is not presented in the story of the waves, and then there's a third wave and maybe a fourth wave, is what I think is so crucial about the 1970s onwards, is a feminist theoretical revolution, an intellectual revolution. Because with the demand for knowledge or understanding knowledge as power, we entered the university, or we went into my generation to teach in the universities, in our own names. The idea of generations I also don't like, because it's sequential and it models itself. This is quite a complicated argument. Okay, so it models itself on the family, so you will have mothers and daughters. Now, one of the effects of the phallocentric system in terms of producing sexual difference on the basis of having and not having is that although it calls itself, as it were, the rule of the father is established as the authority, the law, by the power of negation, by saying no. And in that move, that which was everything, and this is going to sound very vague, but that which was everything for the infant, i.e. was the face of the world as this infant meets it in all its desperate neediness. We're born absolutely dependent. We can't exist without another. We reach out to the world and someone has to hold us, feed us, clothe us, clean us, keep us warm, and guard us against the danger of the world for years and years and years and years. Okay, so the child's relationship to the world, and whoever is the, as it were, the world as it nurtures the child, can be mothers or fathers or grandmothers or aunts or uncles or anybody, etc., but obviously in certain cases, without Nestle's up there to provide you with milk, it has to be a woman of some kind, whether it's your own mother or, people do feed other people's babies, all of that sort of stuff. So the erection, literally, of the father who can say, no, you cannot have what you want, because all you want is to never lose this nurturing figure. It's to construct the figure of everything as nothing. And the mother becomes that figure. So the name mother isn't, I distinguish between, as it were, the nurture and then the law. And the production of these as these paternal and maternal figures means that the space of the mother inherits every longing for everything and every blame. So we get a sort of mother-hating culture where the mother is either too much or too little. You never fed me enough, you fed me too little. You suffocated me or you were never there, right? So every existential anguish of a human being as they confront a world that will fail, will suffocate, will be deficient, will incite limitless demands and needs, gets figured as the mother. Now, for the masculine subject, there's a kind of very complicated way that this is resolved in such a way that you have the benefit of identifying with the father. You have to give up everything you want, but the promise is there, you will get it in a second form. So woman then becomes all that is good in this figure of everything that you will be promised later, but stripped of any of her power. She will just be there to fulfill your needs, right? So you masculinize and heterosexualize men in a particular way so that woman is just this repository of service, right? And there is a fantasy of the maternal plenitude of everything way sort of back, which then becomes the sort of engine of a desire because it will never be satisfied. So no woman will ever meet you. So there's always a failure of woman, which is where some of the violence comes into towards women. And there's a kind of complicated. Whereas for the person who's going to become a girl child, a feminine subject, the account I'm giving you allows for there to be nothing except the discovery that you too are nothing. And your only solution is to try and shape yourself to be the thing that the boy will want. I don't think that completely works, right? I don't think that's the whole story, but it is the story psychoanalysis will constantly give you and culture will constantly give you. So that girls come into the world with a chance to be everything, to identify with everything, to say, God, that's marvelous. This thing of being a woman is just marvelous, and yet to be slowly taught to realize that you are nothing but what you can be for someone else, which means you will have to hate yourself. So this deep structure, and there's nothing in our culture to relieve that. Now, what do I mean by that? So for boys, the sense that they are little, and there's the big, big man who could kill them, take what they want, and they're little and this is big, is relieved when they say, I think my father wants to kill me. And the analyst says, no, your father doesn't want to kill you. He really loves you. He's fine, etc. You'll be all right. You're like him, all the rest. You have all these sort of things. The Oedipal story relieves the anxiety of littleness in relation to bigness and provides a passage for masculinity to the fact that they will always be the son, but they will sort of have the illusion that they will be the father who has the power to say no and therefore also has the power to say you can have what I'm going to give you. Whereas for the feminine child, there's nothing to relieve this particularly distorting vision of who she is because of what this concept of the mother is then presenting. So we have so much history of the anguished relations between daughters and mothers. Obviously some people do have lovely relations, this is true, but in cultural terms, you look at the stories, you look at the representations, they are constantly, in a sense, a way in which the mother is blamed for everything that fails, always failed. It's a most peculiar position to be in, and there is no defense you can mount against it because rationality doesn't stand in it. So there's this terrible psychic damage which is done both to women who have children and have daughters and the daughters who their lives. I think it can be relieved, which is why I'm so interested in the work of Bracha Ettinger, because she dares to say, what if this isn't the only story? So again, going back to feminist interventions and different stories, what if this isn't the only story? And not displacing the Oedipal story, which obviously does happen for reasons and does produce us as speaking subjects, but supplementing it, running underneath it like a kind of hidden stream, is a legacy from our experiences before we are born, when we are sensate in the long process for the last 6 months of a pregnancy, where more or less everything is there and we are kind of resonance chambers for all sorts of elements, that we have an intimation of a relation of a sort of a shared experience. For the mother, it's a shared experience that there's something else. For the child to be, there's no cognizant system, but there's a sensations of the sound of a voice, the rhythms of a movement, being moved when you don't move, the heartbeats, the two heartbeats, all these sorts of elements of it, which we now know from all sorts of stuff that this is remembered in some way. It is impressed on the system. But that becomes, for Bracha, a model, which therefore doesn't imagine that, you are expelled from the womb, and then you are expelled from the breast, and then you face this terrible, I'm going to be mutilated or not mutilated, unless I kind of, mortgage my soul to this Oedipal system that's all based on separation and then this annihilation of the mother. It's that there is always been a kind of a co-emergent other. And there are always events which register for me in one way and register for the other person in another way, but they are shared events. So it's a whole, particularly, it's not nice in the sense it's not cozy, symbiosis. It's very susceptible to violence, if, all sorts of things going on, etc. And then postnatally, she also asks us to think, well, how do little girls work out what it is to be a woman? So she has this concept of fascinance. And she uses these words that, like Derrida uses différence, these French words which are a kind of continuous state. And fascinance is a prolonged kind of learning, gazing, playing with, imitating, trying to work out, here my little childlike body, what is it to be a mature woman? And what is crucial in what she argues is, what is it to be desirable? And I find that very interesting compared to what I was saying in the earlier one, which is if we're told we only have to be what we have to be for, to be the object of desire, we don't have a subjective sense of what it is to be desirable. And desirable isn't just to turn yourself into a sexual object. It's to have a relationship to desire, but also to all sorts of ways of being in the world that articulate a sense of a mature feminine sexuality, whatever that is, whether it's queer or straight or whether you want to have children or not, but some crucial sense that is, in kind of Freudian terms, associated with having a kind of the creative necessary narcissism to think I'm all right, as opposed to always to think I'm not all right, and who's to blame? You, the mother, somebody, the world. Okay, desirability enables us to negotiate also being undesirable in certain kinds of ways. So there's quite a complex involved. So she has this idea of somehow this process by which other women, older women, not necessarily your mother, but someone else, represents something you need to learn. And you will learn slowly over time, selecting and processing and interacting. Now, where this comes a full loop, which is what I think I've been trying to do, going back to what I said about Old Mistresses, trying to create a prehistory for women artists and trying to populate the cultural imaginary with images of creative women, is, in a sense, feeding a fascinance of young women now to say, that's desirable, right? That's desirable, because there's nothing tells us that women are desirable for their brains, for their energy, for their creativity, for their poetry, for their art, for what they do in the world, right? If we don't have women as artists or intellectuals represented, and I think people used Hollywood, particularly in the great eras of the great stars in the 1940s and 50s, why were women in the audience in such numbers, right? Okay, they might have been fantasizing about Clark Gable or whatever, etc. But they're also watching Betty Davis and Joan Crawford. I'm talking about, obviously, the sort of American thing. They're looking at these extraordinary forms of femininity, figurations of femininity, in fascinance, when they were such remarkable actors. They're not just sort of screen stars dressed up and sort of panting, but really great. They were often telling these really fascinating and complicated stories. So melodramas, for all their kind of anguish, are the sites of explorations of processes involving women's lives and things. So that's why, the kind of artistry I want to do is not about, here are just these great women artists and they're just great because they're great women artists. I tell you, she's just as good as Michelangelo. It's not. It's what are those narratives? What is it that involves exploring the lives that these women lived, what they did? I mean, that whole element of the in-depth life, of negotiating life, and then being able to read the work in ways that bring out from the art that is made, in a sense, in a very simple sense, the things that matter. So when I make one final leap into the question of why I say is feminism a bad memory? So my answer is the bad memory that feminists are making because they're ignoring things, the bad memory that the culture is producing and reproducing with this assimilation of it to waves and generations and competitions and mothers and daughters and all the rest of it, is that the depth at which feminism poses its questions to a patriarchal society and to a phallocentric cultural or symbolic order is so profound that it is traumatic. So feminism has happened, but actually the meaning of it is, trauma is that which you can't digest. So you know something has happened, but you don't know what has happened, and you have no access to it as a memory. And yet its energy and its anxiety is pressing perpetually, and it invests later events. It overdetermines the force with which you experience later events. So, and the process of transforming it, for my money, as it were, it does require aesthetic transformation. It's not sufficient for us just to talk about it or to say it. Historical accounts will not have enough affect to capture this, what I'm calling this intensity. So I can give an account, I hope is intelligible, of some of the things that I think are not part of this cultural memory, are not happening when we think of successive waves, which are just, we got tired of you and we have to say, you didn't do this. The second wave didn't do this right. It didn't do that right. It wasn't this. It didn't do it. So the third wave is going to do something better. And then there's going to be a fourth wave because they don't like what the third wave, all of this is a completely destructive model of a history for women because each one is situated but incomplete. So the component, so if we've got a problematic of the memory, we have a sense that something is overwhelming us that we can't even digest it, including women, including feminists, including the culture as a whole. But we have to have the promise of its virtuality, which is to say whatever has been is not an entity that could be washed away and something else come in its place. These are moments, actualizations of elements of its incommensurate, incomprehensible, transformative challenge. So feminism, we are becoming feminists because the virtuality of what it could be is never exhausted by any moment of it. So the moment of the, people like Tristan de Pisa in the sort of 15th century trying to argue with the church about women, or the moment of the, Protestant Puritan women saying, now that you think we should have access to the Word of God, we too need education. We want to be a reader. The moment of the vindication of the rights of women, the 18th century, the 19th century, we need a place in the polity, and the later 20th century, questions of the embodied subject, the feminism of the 1970s and 80s. These are just actualizations. So if we reached out, and that's just one bit of it. Now it's accumulating, and if we don't keep that long history, good memory, we don't see these different moments of it, each one realizing something, each one being incomplete in terms of the ultimate challenge, which goes back, 3,000 years to the point at which a patriarchal system was installed. And we know it was installed because we read the Greek plays, the Greek tragedies, which dramatize, and in their Greek legends, they dramatize the violence with which one system replaced another. That we then have stories of humanity. And when we start looking at, some of the Egyptian ones or some of the worlds outside of the European, the great sort of Greek imagination, we begin to realize that if there are these other stories, these are, human cultures have made them, they can be changed, and we are faced now with a question which is as profound as Medea's. You can't hear the earth anymore. You just live in the cities and the earth is dying beneath you. The planet is doomed. We have gone too far. We will never recover from global warming. And also, we are creating an earth that's devastated humanly. There are more wasted people. Why are there mass migration? I mean, it's mass migration because the land is being stolen because people in the advanced world want the minerals. They don't want the land to be used for growing crops. People own great swathes of the world for the minerals in it and drive the people off. And that we have a planet full of people who are living what Sigmund Bauman calls wasted lives. And this is not just like, let's struggle for the working class not to have such an exploited life. These people have no lives at all, but they do have mobile phones, or someone has. So they can see from their hilltops what the world looks like in the West. And there's hope. They must go like a magnet. But nobody tells them what they're seeing in all the bars and cafes are the Uber drivers and the baristas and the young women and men who are going through our universities, for whom the promise of even lives, decent lives, on any kind of precarity. I mean, what number of 20s and 30-year-olds, and I know this is the case in Spain, are, suffering, no futures are given to them, unemployment. So I think this connecting these things and daring to, and that's why feminism is very traumatic, because it touches on all of them while giving it a kind of turn, which is the very thing that the whole legacy of what we call the phallocentric or the patriarchal, it's made it nothing. It's made everything that you wanted to say about what might be the sources of human life in the maternal or in the feminine or in an order that is not based on this father negating the mother. They've made it nothing, and they've made it undesirable. And even feminists say, oh, we can't go there. That would be terribly theoretically wrong. So I have dared, to align myself with Ettinger and the matrixial because I saw in it something so profound. The minute I was offered, read this, I thought this is of such an order of importance. And we just keep plodding away at trying to put it into the world.